In the summer of 1944, while most of the world was still burning, 44 countries sent their representatives to a quiet mountain town, carrying no weapons, commanding no armies, and signing no surrender documents. Yet what they agreed to in that room would shape global power more decisively than many of the battles still being fought. Because when they left, money itself would no longer work the way it had for centuries. No public vote was held, no populations were consulted, and almost no one outside that room fully understood what had just been decided. But the outcome was simple and staggering. One currency would sit at the center of the global economy. Trade would flow through rules written in advance. Crises would be managed by new institutions rather than collapse into chaos. And for the first time in history, the world would attempt to run its financial system not on gold, not on conquest, but on coordination. This agreement did not end war. It did something more subtle. It decided who would rebuild the world, and on what terms. Because for most of human history, money had been anchored to something tangible, metal pulled from the ground, coins you could weigh, gold you could lock away, systems that collapsed violently when trust failed. And by 1944, trust had failed completely. Currencies had imploded, trade had frozen, and governments had learned the hard way that when money breaks, politics radicalizes, extremism rises, and war follows. The people in that room believed they could prevent that cycle. Their solution was radical. Fix exchange rates, limit monetary chaos, create permanent global institutions to intervene before collapse, and quietly transfer enormous influence to the country best positioned to guarantee stability, not through force, but through liquidity, credit, and confidence. It was an experiment in managed capitalism, and it worked. For decades, trade exploded, growth accelerated, currencies stabilized, and a war-ravaged world rebuilt itself faster than anyone thought possible, all under rules most people never saw, governed by institutions they didn't vote for, backed by promises that relied on faith as much as math. But here's the part almost never mentioned. This system did not just organize recovery, it redistributed power. It determined which nations could run deficits without punishment, which crises would be rescued, which currencies would survive pressure, and which countries would be forced to adjust when the rules tightened, all while appearing neutral, technical, and inevitable. And eventually, the contradictions caught up. Promises outpaced reality, confidence strained. And when the system finally broke, it did not collapse with panic or revolution, but with an announcement, quietly delivered, that the rules no longer applied, and that the world had entered a new monetary era without ever agreeing to it. This is the story of the agreement that controlled the world, not because it was perfect, but because for a time it convinced nearly everyone to play by the same rules. Welcome to Empire Economics. The agreement reached in that mountain town was not vague or symbolic. It was technical, deliberate, and designed to solve a very specific problem that had destroyed the global economy twice in a single generation. Uncontrolled currencies, collapsing trade, and governments forced into desperation when trust evaporated. At its core, the system fixed exchange rates, but not permanently. Each country agreed to peg its currency to a single anchor, and that anchor was pegged to gold, meaning money would no longer float freely or collapse overnight, but it would also no longer be rigid enough to force mass unemployment or political chaos when adjustments were needed. This was the compromise. Currencies could move, but only within narrow bands. Devaluations required approval, and stability, not speculation, became the priority. To enforce this, the agreement created institutions the world had never seen before. Permanent international bodies designed not to rule nations, but to manage crises before they became disasters. One institution would stabilize currencies and provide short-term financial support. Another would fund reconstruction and long-term development. Together, they formed the backbone of a managed global economy, operating above individual governments, yet dependent on them for legitimacy and cooperation. But there was an unavoidable reality beneath the idealism. For the system to work, it needed a center, a currency strong enough, liquid enough, and trusted enough to absorb global demand without breaking. And in 1944, only one country met those conditions, emerging from war with intact industry, massive gold reserves, and the ability to supply the world with both goods and credit. So the system quietly revolved around that currency. Not by decree, but by design. Trade flowed through it, reserves accumulated in it, and global confidence depended on the promise that it could always be exchanged for gold at a fixed rate, a promise that turned financial strength into geopolitical influence, because nations holding that currency now depended on the credibility of its issuer. This created an asymmetric stability. Most countries surrendered a degree of monetary independence in exchange for predictability and access to trade. The center country gained flexibility, able to run deficits, export capital, and supply liquidity without facing the same immediate constraints, because its money was no longer just national, it was systemic. And for a time, the incentives aligned. Reconstruction accelerated. Trade expanded, currencies stabilized, economic growth surged across continents, validating the belief that rules, coordination, and institutions could succeed where gold hoards and competitive devaluations had failed. But beneath the surface, tension accumulated. As global trade expanded, demand for the central currency grew faster than the gold backing it. Promises multiplied, reserves thinned, and the system began to rely not on metal, but on confidence. Confidence that discipline would hold, that adjustments would be made, and that the anchor would remain unquestioned. The agreement had solved the problem of chaos. What it had not solved was the problem of imbalance, and that contradiction would eventually force a reckoning.
For years, the system held together, not because it was perfect, but because everyone needed it to work. And as long as growth continued and confidence remained intact, its internal contradictions could be ignored, postponed, or quietly managed through negotiations that never reached the public eye. But the pressure was real. As global trade expanded, more and more of the central currency flowed outward, accumulating in foreign reserves, while the gold, meant to back those promises, stayed largely in one place, creating a widening gap between obligation and reality, a gap that grew invisible to most people, but impossible for policymakers to ignore. Countries began to question the promise. If everyone demanded conversion at once, the gold would not be there. Confidence, once lost, would collapse the entire structure. Attempts were made to patch the system. Emergency meetings, coordinated interventions, informal agreements to limit conversions. But these were temporary solutions to a permanent imbalance, because the system required the center to supply the world with liquidity, while also demanding restraint to preserve credibility. Two goals that could not coexist indefinitely. By the late 1960s, the contradiction reached its limit. Economic pressures mounted. domestic priorities clashed with international obligations, and maintaining the promise became more costly than breaking it. So, the decision was made quietly. No global conference was called. No replacement system was agreed upon. Instead, an announcement was delivered, framed as temporary, technical, and necessary. The promise would be suspended, convertibility ended, and the rules that had governed the global economy for a generation would no longer apply. Just like that, the agreement was over. The world did not panic. Markets adjusted, trade continued, and the system faded not with collapse, but with acceptance, replaced by floating currencies, financial markets, and a new era where money was anchored not to gold or fixed rules, but to policy, credibility, and power. The remarkable thing is not that the system ended, it's that it lasted as long as it did. For nearly 3 decades, nations with competing interests coordinated their monetary policies, avoided the worst forms of financial warfare, and rebuilt a shattered world under shared constraints, proving that global rules could work, but also revealing the limits of any system that depends on imbalance to survive. What followed was more flexible, more dynamic, and far more volatile. Crises returned, but so did adaptation. Power shifted from agreements to markets, from fixed promises to managed expectations, and from visible rules to complex institutions whose influence is felt most clearly during moments of stress. The agreement that controlled the world did not fail because it was misguided. It failed because it was human, built on trust, compromise, and incentives that changed as circumstances changed. And understanding that matters, because the monetary world you live in today was shaped not just by what replaced it, but by the lessons learned from its rise and quiet end. Lessons about stability, power, and the cost of coordination at a global scale. This is what empire economics is about. Not nostalgia for the past, and not predictions about the future, but clear, grounded stories about how systems are built, how they hold, and why they eventually change. Each episode stands on its own, but together they explain the forces that still shape trade, money, and power today. And there are many more stories like this, hidden in agreements, institutions, and decisions most people never notice, waiting to be understood.